Hello, my dear sleepy listener. Welcome to Sleepy Crown, where history's quiet tales gently carry you into dreamland. Tonight, we embark on a complete journey through the life and mysterious death of one of England's most enigmatic rulers, William II, known as William Rufus, the Red King, whose controversial reign and suspicious death in the New Forest remains one of history's greatest royal mysteries. We'll softly explore his entire remarkable story, from his birth as the unexpected third son in Normandy, through his dramatic seizure of the English throne, his conflicts with the church and his own family, to that fateful hunting expedition on August 2nd, 1100, where an arrow in the forest would end his reign and spark conspiracy theories that fascinate historians to this day. This is a tale of ambition, controversy, and mystery, perfect for drifting off to sleep while pondering the secrets of medieval England. Before you settle in for this long, peaceful journey into the past, I really need your help with something. I notice that many of you wonderful listeners enjoy these videos but don't leave comments. And honestly, that makes me a little sad. Your thoughts, questions, and feedback mean the world to me and help this channel grow. So tonight, I'm gently asking, no, I'm practically begging, please take just a moment to leave a comment below. Tell me what you think about William Rufus. Share which royal mystery fascinates you most, or just say hello. Even a simple, great video or this helped me sleep makes my day. Comments really do help the YouTube algorithm share these videos with other history lovers who might enjoy them. And while you're down there, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe with notifications on so you never miss these soothing historical tales. Your support keeps Sleepy Crown growing and helps me create more of these relaxing journeys through the past. So please, dear listener, be part of our community, leave a comment, then cozy up, close your eyes, and let these gentle whispers from Norman England carry you into the most peaceful sleep. If you're new here, welcome to the Sleepy Crown family. William, later known as King William II of England, entered this world around the year 1057 in the powerful Duchy of Normandy, nestled in what we now call northern France. His arrival came at a time when his father, the future William the Conqueror, who was already establishing himself as one of the most formidable rulers in medieval Europe. The child who had become known as William Rufus was born into a world of constant warfare, political maneuvering, and ambitious conquest. His father, Duke William of Normandy, had spent the previous 15 years consolidating his hold over the fractious Norman nobility, fighting off rival claimants, and building the military machine that would eventually carry him across the English Channel to victory at Hastings. Young William's mother was Matilda of Flanders, a remarkable woman who stood barely 4 feet tall, yet commanded respect throughout the royal courts of Europe. She was the daughter of Baldwin V, Count of Flanders, one of the wealthiest and most influential nobles in France. This marriage alliance had been crucial to William the Conqueror's early success, providing him with powerful allies and securing his southern border against French interference. The union between William and Matilda had initially faced significant opposition from the Catholic Church. Pope Leo IX had condemned their marriage in 1049, declaring it incestuous because the couple were third cousins once removed. According to papal regulations on consanguinity, marriages between individuals who shared ancestors within 7 generations were strictly forbidden. For several years, the Duke and Duchess lived under the threat of excommunication, a serious matter that could have undermined William's political authority and legitimacy. However, by the time young William Rufus was born, his parents had managed to reconcile with the church through diplomatic negotiations and generous donations to religious institutions. The papal ban was lifted, and their children were considered legitimate heirs to the Norman throne. This early brush with ecclesiastical controversy would prove prophetic, as young William would later engage in far more serious conflicts with the church throughout his life. The Norman court into which William Rufus was born was a place of extraordinary energy and ambition. Unlike the more refined and ceremonial courts of France or the Holy Roman Empire, the Norman nobility retained much of their Viking heritage. They were warriors first and courtiers second, men who had carved out their positions through military prowess and personal loyalty to their duke. The atmosphere was one of constant preparation for war, with knights training in the courtyards, weapons being forged in the armories, and strategic councils meeting to plan the next campaign. William Rufus was the third son born to the ducal couple, following his older brothers Robert and Richard. This birth order would prove crucial to his development and eventual rise to power. As the third son, he was not expected to inherit his father's primary titles. Robert, as the eldest, was destined to become Duke of Normandy, while any younger sons would need to make their own way in the world through military service, ecclesiastical careers, or advantageous marriages. The young prince's childhood was marked by the constant sounds of construction and preparation as his father transformed Normandy into a launching pad for greater ambitions. Castles were being built or reinforced throughout the duchy, roads improved to facilitate rapid troop movements, and the Norman fleet expanded in preparation for the great enterprise that would make the family's fortune, the conquest of England. Despite their parents' close familial relationship, William and his siblings were born healthy and vigorous, though they inherited their mother's relatively small stature. William himself would grow to be a stocky man of medium height, with the powerful build typical of Norman warriors. Even as a child, he displayed the physical characteristics that would later earn him his famous nickname, ruddy, reddish complexion, that glowed when he was excited or angry, giving him an almost perpetually flushed appearance. Contemporary chroniclers, writing years later, would describe the adult William Rufus as having fair hair that he wore unusually long for a man of his station, styled with a center parting that left his high forehead prominently displayed. His eyes were described as being of an indeterminate color, flecked with small points of light that seemed to dance when he spoke or laughed. These distinctive features, combined with his stocky build and protruding belly, made him instantly recognizable in any crowd. The young prince's personality began to emerge early in his childhood. Unlike his older brother Robert, who showed signs of the dreamy, impractical nature that would later cause him so much trouble, William Rufus displayed a sharp, practical intelligence combined with an almost reckless courage. He was competitive in everything he did, whether it was learning to ride, practicing with weapons, or competing in games with his siblings and the other noble children at court. William's early education followed the pattern typical for Norman nobility of his generation. He would have learned to read and write in Latin, the language of government and the church, though his later conflicts with ecclesiastical authorities suggest he may not have been the most devoted student of religious texts. More importantly, for a future king, he learned the practical skills of leadership, how to command men, how to assess military situations, and how to navigate the complex web of loyalties and obligations that held medieval society together. The Norman educational system emphasized practical skills over academic learning. Young nobles were expected to master horsemanship, swordsmanship, and the use of various weapons, including the lance, mace, and crossbow. They learned to hunt, both as a form of recreation and as training for warfare, since the skills required to track and kill dangerous game translated directly to military campaigns. William Rufus excelled at these physical pursuits, showing particular aptitude for mounted combat and archery. Perhaps more importantly, the young prince was exposed from an early age to the realities of medieval politics and warfare. Norman society was built on personal relationships between lords and vassals, sealed by oaths of loyalty and maintained through a complex system of obligations and rewards. William learned to navigate these relationships, understanding when to be generous and when to be firm, when to forgive and when to punish. The Norman court was also a place where different cultures and traditions intersected. The Normans themselves were descendants of Viking raiders who had settled in northern France just over a century earlier, but they had quickly adopted French customs, language, and military techniques. At the same time, they maintained connections with Scandinavia and had extensive dealings with Anglo-Saxon England, Flemish merchants, and Italian mercenaries. This cosmopolitan atmosphere exposed young William to different ways of thinking and ruling, preparing him for the challenges he would later face as king of a conquered realm. One of the most significant influences on William's early development was the relationship between his parents. Duke William was known for his fierce temper and autocratic style of rule, but he clearly respected his wife's intelligence and political judgment. Matilda was not merely an ornamental consort. She actively participated in governing the duchy, managed extensive properties in her own right, and served as regent when her husband was away on campaign. This model of partnership between ruler and consort would influence William's own approach to monarchy. Though he would never marry and therefore never experience such a relationship himself, the young prince's relationship with his siblings was complex and would prove crucial to his later political career. His older brother Robert was known even in childhood for his charm and popularity, but also for a certain lack of focus and determination that frustrated their father. Robert was tall, handsome, and skilled in all the knightly arts, but he showed little interest in the tedious work of actual government. He preferred tournaments, feasts, and adventures to the careful planning and attention to detail that effective rule required. William's younger brother Henry was closer to him in age and temperament. Henry was intelligent, ambitious, and willing to work hard to achieve his goals. However, as the youngest son, he had even fewer prospects for inheritance than William, which made him hungry for advancement and potentially unreliable as an ally. The complex dynamics between these three brothers would shape much of the political history of England and Normandy for the next generation. The relationship with his sisters was also important in shaping William's character. Adela, who would later marry Stephen, Count of Blois, showed the same intelligence and political acumen as their mother. Cecily chose a religious life, eventually becoming abbess of Holy Trinity at Caen, while Constance married Alan for Duke of Brittany. These marriages and alliances created a network of family connections that extended across northwestern Europe, providing the Norman dynasty with powerful allies and potential sources of support. During William's childhood, his father was engaged in a series of military campaigns that would serve as both inspiration and training for the young prince. The most significant of these was the gradual expansion of Norman influence into neighboring territories. In 1063, when William Rufus was about 6 years old, his father conquered the county of Maine, adding another substantial territory to the Norman domains. This success demonstrated the effectiveness of Norman military tactics and the rewards that could come from successful warfare. The conquest of Maine was particularly significant because it brought the Normans into direct contact with the powerful Angevin dynasty, rulers of Anjou, and eventual ancestors of the Plantagenet kings of England. The conflict also showcased the brutal efficiency of Norman warfare castells built at strategic points, rapid cavalry strikes against enemy forces, and the systematic destruction of resistance. Young William would have heard detailed accounts of these campaigns from participants, absorbing lessons about strategy, tactics, and the psychology of conquest. Even more momentous was his father's preparation for the invasion of England, which began in earnest when William Rufus was about 9 years old. The claim to the English throne that Duke William pressed was based on his assertion that Edward the Confessor had named him as heir in 1051, and that Harold Godwinson had sworn an oath to support this claim. Whether these assertions were true remains a matter of historical debate, but what is certain is that Duke William assembled one of the most formidable invasion forces of the medieval period. The preparations for the English invasion provided young William with an intensive education in the logistics of medieval warfare. He would have observed the careful planning required to assemble ships, recruit soldiers from across northern France, and coordinate the movement of thousands of men and horses across the English Channel. The enterprise required diplomatic skill to gain the support of the Pope and neighboring rulers, financial acumen to fund the expedition, and military genius to execute the actual invasion. The Battle of Hastings, fought on October 14, 1066, when William Rufus was about 9 years old, transformed his family's fortunes overnight. The victory was complete and decisive. Harold Godwinson was killed, the Anglo-Saxon army was destroyed, and England lay open to Norman conquest. For young William, this triumph must have seemed almost magical, a demonstration of what could be achieved through careful planning, military skill, and divine favor. However, the actual conquest of England proved far more difficult than winning a single battle. The Normans found themselves ruling a hostile population that vastly outnumbered them, speaking a different language, following different customs, and remaining loyal to the defeated Anglo-Saxon nobility. The next several years were marked by a series of rebellions, each requiring military campaigns to suppress. William Rufus grew up hearing accounts of these struggles, learning that conquest was only the beginning of the challenge of ruling a kingdom. The harrying of the North, which took place when William was about 13, provided a particularly harsh lesson in the realities of medieval warfare. When Yorkshire rebelled against Norman rule in 1069 to 1070, Duke William responded with systematic devastation that left much of northern England uninhabitable for years. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, and the population killed or driven away. This campaign was effective in ending resistance, but it also demonstrated the terrible price that could be exacted for defying Norman authority. Young William's education during this period included formal instruction under Lanfranc, one of the most learned men of his generation. Lanfranc had been born in Italy, studied law and theology, and eventually became prior of the monastery at Bec in Normandy. He was appointed Archbishop of Canterbury after the conquest, making him the most senior churchman in England and one of Duke William's most trusted advisors. Under Lanfranc's tutelage, William Rufus received instruction in Latin literature, theological principles, and canon law. However, it quickly became apparent that the young prince had little aptitude or enthusiasm for academic study. His interests lay in more practical pursuits, hunting, military training, and the exercise of authority. This disconnect between William and his religious instructor would prove prophetic, as his later reign would be marked by constant conflict with the church. The young prince's personality was already showing the characteristics that would define his adult reign. He was energetic, ambitious, and utterly confident in his own abilities. He had a sharp wit and a tendency toward sarcasm that could be either charming or cutting, depending on his mood and the circumstances. He was generous to those he liked and trusted, but could be ruthless toward those he considered enemies or obstacles to his goals. William's physical courage was apparent from an early age. He showed no fear in dangerous situations, whether hunting wild boar or training with weapons. This fearlessness would serve him well in his military career, but it also contributed to a certain recklessness that would ultimately prove fatal. He seemed to believe that his own skill and luck would always see him through. Regardless of the risks he took, the young prince's relationship with his father was complex and would prove crucial to his later rise to power. Duke William was a demanding parent who expected his sons to live up to the highest standards of Norman nobility. He had little patience for weakness or failure, and he could be harsh in his judgments. However, he also recognized ability and dedication when he saw it, and he gradually came to see that his third son possessed qualities that his eldest son lacked. Robert Curthose, despite his many attractive qualities, showed an unfortunate tendency toward rebellion and insubordination. In 1077, when William Rufus was about 20, a serious family crisis erupted that would reshape the relationships between the brothers for the rest of their lives. According to the chronicler Orderic Vitalis, the trouble began with what seemed like a harmless prank at the castle of Legel. William Rufus and his younger brother Henry were staying in the same lodging as Robert during a military campaign. After an evening of drinking and gaming, the two younger brothers decided to play a trick on Robert by emptying a chamber pot from an upper window onto him and his companions below. This crude joke infuriated Robert, who saw it as a deliberate insult to his dignity as the eldest son and heir. The incident escalated into a serious brawl, with Robert fighting against both his younger brothers and their supporters. Duke William was forced to intervene personally to restore order, but the damage to family relationships was severe. Robert felt humiliated and disrespected, while William and Henry felt that their brother was taking himself too seriously. More importantly, the incident revealed fundamental differences in character between the three sons. Robert's response to the chamber pot incident was to rebel against his father's authority. He gathered a group of supporters and attempted to seize the important fortress of Rouen, the capital of Normandy. When this failed, he fled the duchy entirely and spent the next several years as an exile, sometimes fighting against his father's forces and sometimes seeking support from foreign rulers. This rebellion showed Robert's courage and determination, but also his poor judgment and inability to think through the consequences of his actions. For William Rufus, his brother's rebellion represented both a crisis and an opportunity. On one hand, it created a dangerous situation for the Norman dynasty, providing enemies with a potential alternative claimant to the duchy. On the other hand, it demonstrated to Duke William that his eldest son might not be suitable to inherit the family's hard-won territories and titles. William Rufus's response to the crisis showed the political intelligence that would serve him well as king. Rather than taking sides in the conflict between his father and brother, he positioned himself as the loyal, reliable son who could be counted on to support the dynasty's interests. He participated in military campaigns against Robert's supporters, but he also worked behind the scenes to maintain family unity and prevent the conflict from spiraling completely out of control. The resolution of Robert's rebellion came in 1079. At the siege of Gerberoy, where father and son fought on opposite sides of a medieval battlefield. Both Duke William and William Rufus were wounded in the fighting, with the Duke suffering a particularly serious injury to his hand. The sight of his father's blood, shed by his brother's supporters, seems to have profoundly affected William Rufus and strengthened his determination to serve as the dynasty's defender. The reconciliation between Duke William and Robert that followed the siege of Gerberoy was largely arranged through the mediation of Queen Matilda, who seems to have been the only person capable of managing the strong personalities of her husband and eldest son. However, the relationship remained fragile, and Duke William clearly began to look more favorably on his third son as a potential heir. This shift in paternal favor became more pronounced after Queen Matilda's death in 1083, with his wife's moderating influence removed. Duke William became increasingly autocratic and demanding. Robert, who had always relied on his mother's support, found himself even more isolated and eventually left Normandy again to seek his fortune elsewhere. This gave William Rufus even more opportunities to demonstrate his loyalty and competence. The death of his mother was a significant blow to William Rufus, who had inherited much of her political intelligence and practical wisdom. Matilda had been one of the few people capable of managing Duke William's fierce temper, and her loss left the court a harsher, more unpredictable place. However, it also eliminated one of the main sources of support for Robert's position as heir, clearing the way for William's eventual succession to the English throne. During the final years of his father's life, William Rufus served as something approaching a crown prince, participating in all major decisions and learning the practical aspects of royal government. He witnessed the compilation of the Domesday Book, the great survey of English landholding completed in 1086, which demonstrated the thoroughness and efficiency of Norman administrative methods. He participated in military campaigns against Scottish incursions and Welsh revolts, gaining experience in the kind of frontier warfare that would characterize much of his own reign. Perhaps most importantly, William learned to navigate the complex relationship between the Norman rulers and their Anglo-Saxon subjects. The conquest of England had created a unique situation in medieval Europe, foreign aristocracy ruling over a much larger native population that retained its own culture, language, and institutions. Success required a careful balance between maintaining Norman military superiority and winning, at least, grudging acceptance from the conquered population. William's education in statecraft included observation of his father's relationship with the English Church, which had been thoroughly reorganized following the conquest. Norman bishops and abbots replaced their Anglo-Saxon predecessors, but the basic structure of English Christianity remained intact. This provided a model that William would follow in his own reign, though his conflicts with Archbishop Anselm would prove far more serious than anything his father had faced. The young prince also learned about the financial foundations of royal power. The Norman kings were wealthy by medieval standards, but their resources were not unlimited. Effective rule required careful management of royal revenues, strategic use of patronage, and the ability to raise additional funds when circumstances demanded it. William would later become notorious for his aggressive taxation policies, but these were based on lessons learned during his father's reign about the importance of maintaining financial strength. As Duke William aged, his health began to decline, though he remained mentally acute and politically active until the end of his life. The succession question became increasingly pressing, especially as Robert showed no signs of settling down to the serious business of government. Various nobles and churchmen offered their opinions about which son would make the best ruler, but Duke William kept his own counsel about his ultimate intentions. The final campaign of Duke William's life came in 1087, when he launched an attack on the French border town of Mantus, in response to raids launched from there into Norman territory. The expedition was successful in military terms, but it proved fatal to the aging duke. While surveying the burning town from horseback, his mount stumbled, and he was thrown against the pommel of his saddle, suffering internal injuries that would prove mortal. William Rufus was present during his father's final illness, which lasted for several weeks at the castle of Rouen. This period provided crucial opportunities for the prince to secure support from key nobles and churchmen for his own succession to the English throne. However, the exact nature of Duke William's final instructions regarding the succession remains controversial, with different sources providing conflicting accounts of his last wishes. What is certain is that Duke William recognized the fundamental problem posed by dividing his territories between his sons. The Norman conquest had created a cross-channel empire in which many nobles held lands on both sides of the English Channel. Dividing England and Normandy between different rulers would create impossible conflicts of loyalty for these nobles, and potentially lead to constant warfare between the two realms. Despite these concerns, Duke William ultimately decided to follow traditional inheritance patterns by leaving Normandy to his eldest son Robert, while designating William Rufus as his successor in England. This decision may have been influenced by practical considerations. Robert was away from Normandy when his father died, while William was present and able to act immediately to secure his inheritance. It may also have reflected Duke William's assessment that while Robert might make an adequate duke of a territory he knew well, he lacked the harder qualities necessary to rule a recently conquered kingdom. The deathbed scene at Rouen in September 1087 marked the end of one of the most successful reigns in medieval history and the beginning of William Rufus's rise to supreme power. The young prince who had grown up in the shadow of a legendary father was about to embark on his own adventure in kingship, armed with all the lessons he had learned during 30 years of careful observation and gradually increasing responsibility. As Duke William breathed his last, William Rufus was already preparing for the dangerous journey across the English Channel that would either secure his crown or end in failure and possibly death. The boy who had once emptied a chamber pot on his brother was about to become one of the most controversial and mysterious rulers in English history, a king whose reign would be marked by constant conflict and whose death would generate conspiracy theories that persist to this day. William, later known as King William II of England, entered this world around the year 1057 in the powerful Duchy of Normandy, nestled in what we now call northern France. His arrival came at a time when his father, the future William the Conqueror, was already establishing himself as one of the most formidable rulers in medieval Europe. The child who would become known as William Rufus was born into a world of constant warfare, political maneuvering, and ambitious conquest. His father, Duke William of Normandy, had spent the previous 15 years consolidating his hold over the fractious Norman nobility, fighting off rival claimants, and building the military machine that would eventually carry him across the English Channel to victory at Hastings. Young William's mother was Matilda of Flanders, a remarkable woman who stood barely 4 feet tall, yet commanded respect throughout the royal courts of Europe. She was the daughter of Baldwin V, Count of Flanders, one of the wealthiest and most influential nobles in France. This marriage alliance had been crucial to William the Conqueror's early success, providing him with powerful allies and securing his southern border against French interference. The union between William and Matilda had initially faced significant opposition from the Catholic Church. Pope Leo IX had condemned their marriage in 1049, declaring it incestuous because the couple were third cousins once removed. According to papal regulations on consanguinity, marriages between individuals who shared ancestors within 7 generations were strictly forbidden. For several years, the Duke and Duchess lived under the threat of excommunication, a serious matter that could have undermined William's political authority and legitimacy. However, by the time young William Rufus was born, his parents had managed to reconcile with the Church. Through diplomatic negotiations and generous donations to religious institutions, the papal ban was lifted, and their children were considered legitimate heirs to the Norman throne. This early brush with ecclesiastical controversy would prove prophetic, as young William would later engage in far more serious conflicts with the Church throughout his life. The Norman court into which William Rufus was born was a place of extraordinary energy and ambition. Unlike the more refined and ceremonial courts of France or the Holy Roman Empire, the Norman nobility retained much of their Viking heritage. They were warriors first and courtiers second, men who had carved out their positions through military prowess and personal loyalty to their duke. The atmosphere was one of constant preparation for war, with knights training in the courtyards, weapons being forged in the armories, and strategic councils meeting to plan the next campaign. William Rufus received the news of his designation as heir to England while standing beside his father's deathbed, surrounded by Norman nobles, clergy, and household knights who had served the conqueror for decades. The moment was charged with both opportunity and tremendous danger. While he had been granted claim to the wealthiest prize in the conqueror's empire, he would need to move swiftly and decisively to make that claim a reality. The journey from Rouen to the English coast required careful planning and considerable courage. The roads between Normandy and the Channel ports were filled with potential enemies, supporters of Robert Curthose who might attempt to prevent William from reaching England, bandits who preyed on travelers carrying valuable cargo, and rival nobles who might see advantage in the confusion following the conqueror's death. William chose to travel light and fast, accompanied by only his most trusted companions and carrying minimal baggage that might slow his progress. The crossing of the English Channel in late September 1087 was fraught with additional perils. Autumn storms made the voyage dangerous even under the best circumstances, and the primitive ships of the period offered little protection against wind and waves. More importantly, William had no way of knowing what reception awaited him on the English side of the water. News of the conqueror's death would already have reached England, and various factions might be preparing to contest his succession. William's landing at one of the Channel ports, most likely Dover or Portsmouth, marked the beginning of one of the most audacious bids for royal power in medieval history. He was claiming a throne based on his father's deathbed designation, but that claim would mean nothing if he could not enforce it through political skill and, if necessary, military strength. The young prince, who had spent 30 years preparing for this moment, was about to discover whether his education had been adequate for the challenge he now faced. The first crucial test came at Winchester, the ancient capital of Anglo-Saxon England, and the location of the royal treasury. Control of this vast accumulation of gold, silver, jewels, and other valuables was essential to any successful bid for the throne. Medieval kingship required the ability to reward supporters generously and to fund military campaigns against enemies, both of which depended on access to royal wealth accumulated over generations. William's arrival at Winchester was a masterpiece of political theatre designed to project confidence and legitimacy. Rather than skulking into the city like a usurper, he rode openly through the streets, accompanied by a growing entourage of nobles and clergy who had decided to support his claim. His bearing was that of a man who had every right to be there, not a challenger seeking to steal what belonged to others. The guardian of the royal treasury was a Norman noble named William of St. Calais, Bishop of Durham, who had served the conqueror faithfully but now faced an agonizing choice between competing loyalties. On one hand, Robert Curthose was the eldest son and traditional heir. On the other hand, William Rufus was present with apparent authority from their recently deceased father. The bishop's decision to open the treasury to William Rufus proved crucial to the success of the entire enterprise. With the royal wealth secured, William moved quickly to implement the next phase of his planned travelling to Westminster Abbey for a coronation ceremony that would provide religious legitimacy for his rule. The journey from Winchester to London normally took several days, but William covered the distance with remarkable speed, driven by awareness that delay could be fatal to his cause. Every day that passed without a crowned king gave potential rivals more time to organize opposition. The coronation ceremony took place on September 26, 1087, just 17 days after the conqueror's death. This rapid timeline was unprecedented in medieval royal succession and demonstrated both William's political skills and the support he had managed to assemble among key members of the English elite. The ceremony was performed by Lanfranc, Archbishop of Canterbury, whose participation provided crucial ecclesiastical legitimacy for the new king's reign. Lanfranc's role in William's coronation was particularly significant because the elderly archbishop had been one of the conqueror's closest advisors and most trusted friends. His willingness to crown William Rufus sent a powerful message to potential opponents that the new king represented continuity with his father's policies, rather than a dangerous break with established tradition. This perception of legitimacy would prove crucial in the challenges that lay ahead. The coronation ceremony itself followed established Anglo-Saxon traditions that had been adapted by the Norman conquerors to emphasize the sacred nature of royal authority. William swore the traditional coronation oath, promising to defend the church, maintain justice, and protect his subjects from oppression. These were standard promises that all medieval kings made, but William's subsequent reign would demonstrate a rather flexible interpretation of these obligations. The immediate aftermath of the coronation was marked by a flurry of political activity, as William worked to consolidate his position and neutralize potential threats to his authority. His first priority was securing the loyalty of the great Norman nobles who controlled much of England's land and military resources. Many of these men held territories on both sides of the English Channel, creating a fundamental conflict of loyalty. Now that England and Normandy were ruled by different brothers, William's approach to this challenge demonstrated the political sophistication he had learned during years of observation at his father's court. Rather than demanding immediate and exclusive loyalty, he allowed these nobles time to assess the situation and make their own decisions about which brother to support. This patient approach avoided forcing a premature confrontation while giving him time to demonstrate his effectiveness as a ruler. One of William's most important early decisions was his generous distribution of gifts and privileges to influential supporters. Following the deathbed instructions of his father regarding the disposition of royal treasure, monasteries and churches throughout England received substantial donations of gold and precious objects, while secular nobles were rewarded with grants of land, titles, and other valuable privileges. This largesse served multiple purposes, demonstrated William's wealth and power, fulfilled his father's final wishes, and created a network of beneficiaries with strong incentives to support the new regime. The distribution of royal wealth also served to differentiate William from his brother Robert, who was known for his chronic financial difficulties and inability to reward supporters adequately. Medieval rulership was fundamentally about the exchange of loyalty for rewards, and a king who could not afford to be generous was unlikely to maintain power for long. William's early demonstration of his ability and willingness to share royal resources sent a powerful message about the benefits of supporting his reign. However, not everyone was convinced that William represented the best choice for England's future. A significant faction of Norman nobles, led by Odo of Bayeux, the conqueror's half-brother, believed that Robert Curthos should rule both England and Normandy as their father had done. These men began organizing resistance to William's rule almost immediately after his coronation, setting the stage for the first major crisis of the new reign. Odo of Bayeux was one of the most powerful figures in the Norman establishment, serving as both Bishop of Bayeux and Earl of Kent. He had been one of the conqueror's most trusted lieutenants during the invasion of England and had accumulated vast wealth and extensive lands on both sides of the Channel. His opposition to William represented a serious threat because of his ability to influence other nobles and his control over significant military resources. The rebellion that emerged in 1088 was not simply a spontaneous uprising against an unpopular king, but a carefully planned attempt to reverse the division of the conqueror's empire and reunite England and Normandy under Robert's rule. The conspirators included some of the most powerful men in England: Roger de Montgomery, Earl of Shrewsbury, Geoffrey, Bishop of Coutances, and Robert, Count of Morton, among others. Even William's own younger brother Henry initially supported the rebellion, demonstrating the complex family dynamics that characterized Norman royal politics. The rebels' strategy was to coordinate an invasion from Normandy with simultaneous uprisings at key points throughout England. They strengthened their castles, gathered weapons and supplies, and sent messages to Robert Curthose, encouraging him to launch an invasion fleet. The plan was sophisticated and had excellent prospects for success if executed properly, which made William's response all the more remarkable. Rather than relying solely on his Norman supporters, William made the innovative decision to appeal directly to the native English population for support against the rebels. This was a risky strategy because the English had little reason to love their Norman conquerors, but William correctly calculated that they would prefer a single strong king to the chaos and warfare that would result from a disputed succession. William's appeal to the English was accompanied by concrete promises of better treatment, lower taxes, respect for traditional laws and customs, and protection from the arbitrary violence that had characterized the immediate aftermath of the conquest. These promises represented a significant departure from previous Norman policy and demonstrated William's willingness to adapt his approach to the realities of ruling a conquered population. The English response to William's appeal exceeded his most optimistic expectations. Anglo-Saxon militias throughout the kingdom rallied to the royal standard, providing William with a substantial military advantage over the rebels. This support was not based on any great affection for Norman rule, but rather on the practical calculation that a quick victory for William would end the conflict and restore stability more rapidly than a prolonged civil war. The rebellion collapsed with surprising speed once William demonstrated his ability to command broader support than the rebels had anticipated. Key fortresses fell to royal forces, leading conspirators were captured or fled into exile, and Robert Curthose's promised invasion fleet never materialized. By the end of 1088, William had not only survived the greatest threat to his reign, but had emerged stronger than ever, with enhanced legitimacy and a broadened base of support. William's treatment of the defeated rebels demonstrated both his political pragmatism and his understanding of the need to balance justice with mercy. While Odo of Bayeux was stripped of his English lands and forced into exile, most other participants were allowed to retain their properties and positions after swearing new oaths of loyalty. This lenient approach encouraged others to accept William's rule rather than continue resistance, while avoiding the cycle of retribution that could have destabilized the kingdom for years. The successful suppression of the 1088 rebellion marked William's transformation from a claimant to the throne into a genuinely effective king. He had demonstrated his ability to outmaneuver sophisticated opponents, build unexpected coalitions, and use both force and diplomacy to achieve his goals. These skills would be tested repeatedly throughout his reign, but his early success provided a foundation of confidence and legitimacy that would sustain him through future challenges. With internal opposition neutralized, William turned his attention to external threats, particularly from Scotland, where King Malcolm III had been probing the northern borders of England since the Conqueror's death. Malcolm, known as Malcolm Canmore, was one of the most formidable rulers of his generation and had been a persistent thorn in the side of Norman England since 1066. His marriage to Margaret, a member of the displaced Anglo-Saxon royal family, gave him a potential claim to the English throne and a strong motivation to challenge Norman rule. The Scottish threat was particularly serious because Malcolm controlled substantial military resources and had decades of experience in warfare. Against English forces, his kingdom stretched from the Highlands to the borders of Northumberland, and his warriors were renowned for their ferocity and skill in border warfare. More importantly, Scottish resistance to Norman rule enjoyed widespread support among the native population of northern England, many of whom retained cultural and familial connections to Scotland. William's first campaign against Scotland in 1091 demonstrated his ability to apply the military lessons he had learned during his father's reign while adapting them to the specific challenges of border warfare. Rather than attempting a direct invasion of Scotland, which would have required enormous resources and risked heavy casualties in unfamiliar terrain, William chose a more sophisticated strategy designed to force Malcolm to accept English overlordship. Without the need for a decisive battle, the campaign began with careful diplomatic preparation. As William assembled not only English forces but also allies from Wales and Ireland who had their own reasons for opposing Scottish expansion, this coalition building demonstrated the new king's understanding that medieval warfare was as much about politics as military tactics, and that lasting victories required the construction of sustainable alliances rather than simply the defeat of enemies in battle. William's army advanced into southern Scotland in a carefully coordinated movement that combined land and sea forces, while the main army moved north along the traditional invasion route through Northumberland. A naval fleet sailed around the Scottish coast to threaten Malcolm's supply lines and prevent him from concentrating his forces in any single location. This pincer movement forced the Scottish king to divide his attention between multiple threats and prevented him from using his superior knowledge of local terrain to maximum advantage. The decisive moment of the campaign came not through battle, but through negotiation, as Malcolm recognized that he could not effectively resist the coordinated English assault and agreed to meet William for peace talks. The resulting agreement required Malcolm to acknowledge William as his overlord and to provide hostages as security for his future good behavior. In return, William confirmed Malcolm's right to rule Scotland and provided him with certain English territories that had traditionally been disputed between the two kingdoms. This diplomatic resolution of the Scottish crisis demonstrated William's sophisticated understanding of medieval statecraft and his preference for achieving political objectives through negotiation when possible rather than relying solely on military force. The agreement with Malcolm provided security for England's northern border while avoiding the enormous costs and risks associated with attempting to conquer Scotland outright. The success of the Scottish campaign enhanced William's reputation throughout medieval Europe and demonstrated that the new English king was capable of managing the complex challenges of frontier warfare. Medieval kingship required constant vigilance against external enemies, and William's early victories established his credibility as a military leader capable of defending his realm against all comers. With Scotland neutralized as an immediate threat, William turned his attention to the equally challenging problem of Wales, where native princes had been conducting raids into English territory and threatening the stability of the western borders. The Welsh political situation was even more complex than Scotland, with multiple competing kingdoms and a long tradition of resistance to foreign domination that dated back to Roman times. William's approach to the Welsh problem differed significantly from his strategy in Scotland, reflecting his recognition that different challenges required different solutions. Rather than seeking a single decisive campaign, he implemented a systematic policy of gradual expansion and consolidation that would extend English control into Welsh territory through a combination of military pressure, diplomatic agreements, and strategic castle-building. The construction of new fortifications along the Welsh border represented one of William's most significant innovations in military strategy. Unlike his father, who had relied primarily on existing strongholds captured from the Anglo-Saxons, William built new castles specifically designed to control Welsh territory and support further expansion. These fortifications were located at carefully chosen strategic points that controlled important valleys, river crossings, and mountain passes. The Welsh campaigns of the early 1090s demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of Norman military power when applied to the challenging terrain and guerrilla warfare tactics favored by Welsh fighters. While William's forces achieved several notable victories and succeeded in extending English control over significant new territories, they never achieved the complete conquest that had been possible in England after 1066. The persistent resistance encountered in Wales forced William to develop new approaches to the challenge of ruling a hostile population that retained strong cultural identity and effective military organization. Unlike the Anglo-Saxons, who had been thoroughly defeated in a single campaign, the Welsh maintained their ability to resist Norman rule through hit-and-run tactics, strategic withdrawals into mountainous terrain, and the exploitation of their superior knowledge of local geography. William's response to these challenges demonstrated his ability to learn from experience and adapt his strategies to changing circumstances. Rather than persisting with tactics that had proved unsuccessful, he developed a more flexible approach that combined military pressure with diplomatic outreach to Welsh leaders who might be willing to accept English overlordship in exchange for recognition of their local authority. The gradual success of this approach was demonstrated by the establishment of a series of marcher lordships along the Welsh border, where Norman nobles were granted extensive autonomy in exchange for accepting responsibility for defending their territories against Welsh attacks. This system created a buffer zone between the settled English heartland and the unconquered Welsh highlands, while providing ambitious Norman nobles with opportunities for expansion and enrichment. The marcher lordships represented an innovative solution to one of the fundamental challenges of medieval frontier warfare: to maintain effective control over disputed territories without the enormous ongoing expense of maintaining large, permanent garrisons. By granting local autonomy to trusted nobles who had strong personal incentives to defend their lands, William created a self-sustaining system of border defense that would persist for centuries. The success of William's Welsh policy was demonstrated by the relative stability that characterized the border region for the remainder of his reign. While complete conquest remained elusive, the combination of military pressure, strategic fortification, and diplomatic accommodation succeeded in neutralizing Wales as a major threat to English security and created the foundation for future expansion. The resolution of the Scottish and Welsh challenges allowed William to turn his attention to the even more complex problem of his relationship with his brother Robert and the future of Normandy. The division of their father's territories had created an inherently unstable situation that threatened the interests of nobles who held lands on both sides of the English Channel and created opportunities for foreign enemies to exploit Norman divisions. Robert Curthos had proved to be exactly the kind of ineffective ruler that their father had feared he would become. His generous nature and love of chivalric adventure made him popular among the Norman nobility, but his inability to manage finances or maintain order had allowed the duchy to slide into chaos. Castles were seized by independent lords, roads became unsafe for travel, and the ducal revenues that should have supported Robert's government were diverted to private purposes. This deterioration of Norman authority presented William with both opportunities and challenges. On one hand, Robert's failures made it increasingly clear that he was unsuited for effective rule and created pressure for the reunification of England and Normandy under more competent leadership. On the other hand, any attempt by William to interfere in Norman affairs, risked provoking a wider conflict that could destabilize both kingdoms. William's initial approach to the Norman problem was characteristically subtle and patient. Rather than launching a direct invasion or making public demands for territorial concessions, he began providing quiet support to Norman nobles who opposed Robert's rule. This support took the form of financial subsidies, military advisors, and safe havens for nobles who were forced to flee Norman territory after unsuccessful rebellions against ducal authority. The strategy of supporting Robert's opponents while maintaining plausible deniability allowed William to weaken his brother's position without taking responsibility for the resulting chaos. This approach reflected his understanding that medieval politics often required indirect methods and that premature action could be counterproductive if it united Robert's supporters against a common external enemy. The effectiveness of this strategy was demonstrated by the gradual erosion of Robert's authority throughout the late 1080s and early 1090s. Key fortresses fell to rebel nobles supported by English gold. Important cities declared their independence from ducal authority, and Robert's ability to raise revenues for his own defense declined steadily. By 1091, the situation had become so serious that Robert was forced to seek reconciliation with William in order to survive as duke. The reconciliation between the brothers in 1091 represented a significant diplomatic achievement for William, who managed to gain substantial territorial concessions while allowing Robert to retain his nominal authority as Duke of Normandy. Under the terms of their agreement, William gained control of several important Norman fortresses and territories while promising to provide military support for Robert's efforts to restore order in the duchy. This agreement represented a careful balance between William's desire to extend his authority into Normandy and his recognition that completely destroying Robert's position would create chaos that could harm English interests. By maintaining Robert as a dependent ally rather than conquering Normandy outright, William gained most of the benefits of control while avoiding the enormous costs and risks associated with direct rule over hostile territory. The implementation of the 1091 agreement required William to demonstrate his military effectiveness in supporting Robert's campaigns against rebellious Norman nobles. These joint operations provided valuable experience in coordinating English and Norman forces while demonstrating to potential opponents that the brothers could work together effectively when their interests aligned. One of the most significant joint campaigns was the siege of Mont Saint-Michel, where their younger brother Henry had established himself as an independent lord in defiance of both his older brothers. The siege demonstrated William's personal courage and military skill when he single-handedly charged a group of Henry's supporters who had insulted him, only to be unhorsed and nearly killed before being rescued by his own men. This incident, recorded in detail by contemporary chroniclers, revealed important aspects of William's character that would define his subsequent reign. His willingness to risk his life over a perceived insult demonstrated both his personal courage and his sometimes reckless disregard for the political consequences of his actions. The fact that he was rescued by enemy soldiers who recognized his royal status showed that even his opponents respected his personal bravery. The resolution of the siege of Mont Saint-Michel through negotiation rather than assault demonstrated William's growing political sophistication and his understanding that military victory was not always the best solution to political problems. Henry was allowed to withdraw with his forces intact, but his attempted rebellion had failed to gain significant support and had demonstrated the risks of opposing both his older brothers. Simultaneously, the success of the joint campaigns in Normandy strengthened the relationship between William and Robert, while demonstrating to potential opponents that the division of their father's territories did not necessarily mean permanent hostility between the brothers. This perception of unity helped to stabilize both kingdoms and reduced the incentives for foreign enemies to attempt to exploit Norman divisions. However, the improved relationship between William and Robert was threatened by developments beyond their immediate control, particularly the growing influence of the church reform movement that was sweeping across medieval Europe. The investiture controversy, which pitted secular rulers against papal authority over the appointment of bishops and abbots, was beginning to affect England and Normandy, just as it had disrupted other kingdoms throughout the continent. William's relationship with the church had been generally positive during the early years of his reign, largely due to the moderating influence of Lanfranc, Archbishop of Canterbury, who had served his father faithfully and provided crucial legitimacy for William's succession. However, Lanfranc's death in 1089 created a vacuum in church leadership that would prove increasingly problematic as William's policies brought him into conflict with reform-minded clergy. The death of Lanfranc represented the end of an era in Anglo-Norman church relations and the beginning of a new phase, characterized by increasing tension between royal authority and ecclesiastical independence. Lanfranc had been able to balance his loyalty to the Norman dynasty with his responsibilities as a church leader, but his successors would prove less willing to accommodate royal interference in church affairs. William's response to Lanfranc's death revealed both his political calculations and his fundamental misunderstanding of the changing relationship between church and state in medieval Europe. Rather than appointing a successor immediately, he chose to leave the archbishopric vacant and to appropriate its substantial revenues for royal use. This decision provided short-term financial benefits, but created long-term political problems that would plague the remainder of his reign. The vacancy at Canterbury became a symbol of William's broader approach to church relations, which prioritized royal authority and financial advantage over religious considerations. This approach was consistent with the policies of his father and represented traditional Norman practice, but it was increasingly out of step with the reform movement that was gaining influence throughout medieval Europe. The growing tension between William and the church was exacerbated by his aggressive taxation policies, which affected ecclesiastical institutions as severely as secular ones. Monasteries and cathedrals that had grown accustomed to royal protection and generous donations during his father's reign found themselves subjected to heavy financial demands that strained their resources and limited their ability to fulfill their religious missions. These policies created a growing constituency of opposition within the church that would eventually coalesce around the appointment of Anselm as Archbishop of Canterbury in 1093. Anselm was one of the leading intellectual figures of his generation and a strong supporter of church reform, making him an inherently problematic choice for a king who insisted on maintaining traditional royal prerogatives over ecclesiastical affairs. The appointment of Anselm occurred during a serious illness that brought William close to death and apparently inspired him to consider the spiritual consequences of his policies. However, his recovery was followed by a return to his previous approach to church relations, setting the stage for one of the most serious conflicts between church and state in medieval English history. The developing conflict with Anselm represented more than a simple disagreement over policy. It reflected fundamental differences in worldview between a king who saw the church as another institution to be controlled for political advantage and an archbishop who believed that spiritual authority took precedence over temporal power. This conflict would define much of the later period of William's reign and contribute to his reputation as an enemy of the church. As the 1090s progressed, William's position appeared to be stronger than ever. He had successfully defended his throne against internal rebellion, neutralized external threats from Scotland and Wales, gained significant influence in Normandy, and accumulated substantial wealth through his aggressive fiscal policies. However, beneath this apparent success lay growing tensions that would ultimately contribute to the mysterious circumstances of his death. The success of William's early reign demonstrated his effectiveness as a medieval ruler and his ability to overcome the challenges posed by a disputed succession, hostile neighbors, and competing claims to authority. His political skills, military competence, and administrative efficiency had transformed him from a usurping younger son into one of the most powerful monarchs in medieval Europe. However, the methods he used to achieve this success had also created enemies who would not forget his harsh treatment of their interests, setting the stage for the final act of his dramatic reign. The death of William the Conqueror on September 9, 1087, at the Priory of Saint-Gervais near Rouen, created one of the most complex succession crises in medieval European history. For 21 years, the formidable Duke had ruled both Normandy and England as a unified cross-channel empire, but his final decision to divide these territories between his sons threatened to destroy everything he had built. Perhaps no aspect of William's reign generated more criticism from contemporary observers than his relationship with the Church, which deteriorated steadily throughout the 1090s and eventually became one of the defining conflicts of medieval English history. The roots of this conflict lay in fundamental disagreements about the proper relationship between secular and spiritual authority, but they were exacerbated by William's aggressive fiscal policies and his apparent indifference to religious sensibilities. Death of Lanfranc in 1089 had removed the last moderating influence on William's approach to church relations. Lanfranc had served the Norman dynasty faithfully since before the conquest of England, and his combination of personal loyalty, political wisdom, and genuine religious devotion had enabled him to maintain good relations with both royal and ecclesiastical authorities. His death left a vacuum that would prove impossible to fill with someone equally acceptable to both church and crown. William's decision to leave the Archbishopric of Canterbury vacant for 4 years after Lanfranc's death was motivated primarily by financial considerations, but it sent a powerful message about his priorities and his attitude toward church authority. The Archbishopric was one of the wealthiest institutions in England, with extensive landholdings, substantial annual revenues, and accumulated treasures that represented generations of royal and noble donations. By keeping the position vacant, William could divert these resources to royal use, while avoiding the need to negotiate with a potentially troublesome archbishop. This practice of keeping ecclesiastical offices vacant was not unique to Canterbury. William applied the same approach to numerous bishoprics and abbacies throughout England, treating them essentially as temporary sources of royal revenue rather than spiritual institutions with important religious functions. Contemporary chroniclers calculated that William appropriated the revenues of 16 bishoprics and 12 major abbeys during his reign, representing an enormous transfer of wealth from church to crown. The financial benefits of this policy were substantial and helped to fund William's military campaigns, construction projects, and generous rewards to loyal supporters. However, the political and spiritual costs were equally significant, as the policy created a growing constituency of opposition within the church and damaged William's reputation among the broader population, which retained strong attachment to traditional religious practices and institutions. The controversy surrounding William's treatment of the church was intensified by his personal lifestyle, which contemporary observers found deeply offensive to religious sensibilities. Unlike his father, who had maintained at least the appearance of conventional piety, William seemed to take pleasure in shocking religious authorities with his behavior and comments. His court was characterized by luxury, extravagance, and what contemporary chroniclers described as moral laxity that violated traditional Christian teachings. William's personal appearance became a particular source of criticism from ecclesiastical writers who objected to his fashionable clothing, elaborate hairstyles, and general attention to physical appearance that they considered inappropriate for a Christian ruler. The king's hair was worn longer than was traditional for men of his generation, styled with a center parting that left his forehead prominently displayed, and apparently maintained with considerable care and expense. His clothing featured the latest continental fashions, including pointed shoes, short tunics, and rich fabrics that emphasized style over functionality. These details of personal appearance might seem trivial, but they carried significant political and cultural meaning in medieval society. Traditional Christian teaching emphasized simplicity, humility, and indifference to worldly vanity, while royal authority was supposed to be exercised with dignity and proper respect for established customs. William's deliberate flouting of these expectations was interpreted by his critics as evidence of deeper moral failings and spiritual corruption. More seriously, William was accused of tolerating or even encouraging moral behavior at his court that violated Christian teachings about sexuality and proper conduct. Contemporary chroniclers reported that his household included men who wore their hair and clothing in feminine styles, engaged in what were considered unnatural sexual practices, and generally conducted themselves in ways that scandalized traditional observers. While the specific details of these accusations are difficult to verify, their persistence in multiple sources suggests that William's court had acquired a reputation for unconventional behavior that distinguished it from other royal households of the period. The question of William's own sexuality became a persistent source of speculation and controversy, both during his lifetime and among later historians. Unlike virtually all other medieval kings, William never married and produced no known children, either legitimate or illegitimate. This was highly unusual for a ruler whose dynasty depended on producing heirs, and it naturally led to questions about his personal inclinations and motivations. Various explanations have been proposed for William's unmarried status. Some historians have suggested that he may have taken a vow of celibacy, though this would have been extremely unusual for a secular ruler and inconsistent with his other apparent attitudes toward religious obligations. Others have proposed that he may have used the possibility of marriage as a diplomatic tool, maintaining relationships with potential allies by keeping open the possibility of matrimonial alliances without ever committing to specific arrangements. The most persistent theory, however, has been that William was homosexual or bisexual, which would explain both his lack of interest in marriage and the rumors about the unconventional behavior of his court. Contemporary sources are ambiguous on this point. While they clearly disapproved of his lifestyle, they generally avoided making explicit accusations about his sexual behavior. Later, medieval chroniclers were more direct in their suggestions, but they were writing with the benefit of hindsight and may have been influenced by their knowledge of how his reign ended. Modern historians have generally concluded that while William's sexuality remains a matter of speculation, the available evidence suggests that he was indeed homosexual or bisexual. This conclusion is based not only on his unmarried status and the contemporary rumors about his court, but also on the pattern of his personal relationships and the rewards he granted to certain male favorites who seem to have enjoyed unusual influence and access to royal patronage. Regardless of the truth about William's personal life, the rumors and speculations surrounding his sexuality contributed to his controversial reputation and provided his enemies with additional ammunition for criticism. In medieval society, accusations of sexual deviance were often used as political weapons, and the persistence of such rumors suggests that they were effective in damaging William's standing among at least some segments of the population. The most Serious crisis in William's relationship with the church occurred in 1093, when a severe illness brought him close to death and apparently inspired him to reconsider his policies toward religious institutions. During this illness, which lasted for several weeks and left observers genuinely uncertain about his survival, William made a series of promises about reforming his government and restoring proper relations with the church. The most significant of these promises was his commitment to appoint a new Archbishop of Canterbury, ending the 4-year vacancy that had scandalized religious opinion throughout England and beyond. The man chosen for this crucial position was Anselm of Bec, one of the most distinguished theologians and philosophers of his generation, whose reputation for learning and holiness made him an obvious candidate for the highest ecclesiastical office in England. Anselm was an Italian who had spent most of his career at the monastery of Bec in Normandy, where he had served as prior and then abbot, while developing a reputation as one of Europe's leading intellectual figures. His philosophical and theological writings were already influential throughout the scholarly world, and his personal piety was universally acknowledged even by those who disagreed with his political positions. His appointment as Archbishop of Canterbury was welcomed by reform-minded clergy throughout Europe as a sign that England would finally join the broader movement for church independence from secular control. However, Anselm's appointment also created the potential for serious conflict with royal authority, since he was a strong supporter of the papal reform movement that challenged traditional royal prerogatives over church affairs. The investiture controversy that was disrupting other European kingdoms was based on competing claims about who had the authority to appoint bishops and abbots. Secular rulers who claimed this right based on their control over church lands and revenues, or church authorities who argued that spiritual offices could only be filled by spiritual leaders. William's recovery from his illness was followed by a return to his previous policies and attitudes, setting the stage for inevitable conflict with his new archbishop. Anselm, for his part, seems to have accepted the appointment with full awareness that it would bring him into conflict with royal authority, but with determination to defend what he saw as the legitimate rights and independence of the Church. The developing conflict between William and Anselm was exacerbated by broader political developments that were reshaping the relationship between England and continental Europe. The First Crusade, launched by Pope Urban II in 1095, created new opportunities and challenges for European rulers while demonstrating the growing influence of papal authority over secular affairs. William's response to the crusading movement revealed both his political pragmatism and his fundamental indifference to the religious enthusiasm that motivated many of his contemporaries. Rather than joining the crusade himself or encouraging his nobles to participate, he saw the movement primarily as an opportunity to advance his own political interests. When his brother Robert decided to join the crusade, William recognized that this decision could be turned to his advantage. Robert's participation in the First Crusade required substantial financial resources to fund his expedition, purchase equipment, and maintain his forces during what was expected to be a lengthy campaign in the Holy Land. Like many other crusading nobles, Robert found himself in the position of needing to raise large sums of money quickly, which created opportunities for more financially secure rulers to acquire temporary control over valuable territories. The agreement reached between William and Robert in 1096 represented one of the most significant political transactions of William's reign. In exchange for a payment of 10,000 marks roughly, equivalent to a quarter of William's annual royal revenue, Robert agreed to mortgage the Duchy of Normandy to his brother for the duration of his absence on crusade. This arrangement gave William effective control over both England and Normandy for the first time since their father's death, temporarily reuniting the cross-Channel Empire that had been divided in 1087. The financial terms of this agreement were staggering by medieval standards and required William to implement extraordinary taxation measures throughout England to raise the necessary funds. The chroniclers report that every village, town, and city was assessed heavy taxes, that church treasures were confiscated or sold, and that nobles were required to contribute substantial sums beyond their normal feudal obligations. The burden of these taxes fell most heavily on the common population, who had little voice in political decisions, but were required to bear the financial cost of their king's ambitious policies. Despite the immediate hardship caused by this taxation, the acquisition of Normandy represented a tremendous strategic and political victory for William. The reunification of his father's empire eliminated the divided loyalties that had plagued Anglo-Norman nobles since 1087, removed the threat of conflict with Robert, and positioned William as one of the most powerful rulers in northwestern Europe. The temporary nature of the arrangement. Robert was expected to return from crusade within a few years, meant that William could enjoy these benefits without the long-term complications that might arise from permanently dispossessing his brother, William's administration of Normandy during Robert's absence demonstrated both his administrative competence and his determination to maximize the benefits of his temporary authority. He moved quickly to restore order in regions that had fallen into chaos during Robert's ineffective rule, rebuilt castles that had been damaged or destroyed during rebellions, and re-established ducal control over nobles who had declared their independence from central authority. The restoration of order in Normandy required a combination of military action and diplomatic negotiation, as William needed to convince rebellious nobles that their interests would be better served by accepting his authority than by continuing their resistance. His approach was characteristically pragmatic. Those who submitted voluntarily were confirmed in their holdings and treated generously, while those who continued to resist faced the full force of Anglo-Norman military power. One of William's most significant achievements during his regency in Normandy was the successful campaign to regain control of Maine, the strategically important county that lay between Normandy and the hostile territory controlled by the Counts of Anjou. Maine had been conquered by William the Conqueror in the 1060s, but had been lost during the chaos that followed his death and Robert's ineffective rule of the duchy. The campaign to reconquer Maine demonstrated William's military skills and his understanding of the importance of controlling strategic territories that protected the approaches to Normandy. The county was valuable not only for its own resources, but also because it served as a buffer against Angevin expansion and controlled important trade routes between northern and southern France. The successful restoration of Norman control over Maine was achieved through a combination of military pressure and diplomatic negotiation with Helius de la Flache, the nobleman who had seized control of the county during the period of Norman weakness. Rather than attempting to destroy Helius entirely, William negotiated an agreement that recognized Norman overlordship while allowing the local nobility to retain their positions and properties. Under new terms of allegiance, this diplomatic approach to the main problem reflected William's growing sophistication as a ruler and his understanding that lasting political solutions often required compromise and accommodation rather than complete military victory. The agreement with Helius provided security for Normandy's southern border while avoiding the enormous costs and risks associated with a prolonged military campaign in hostile territory. The success of William's Norman regency enhanced his reputation throughout medieval Europe and demonstrated his effectiveness as a ruler on a continental scale. The transformation of Normandy from a chaotic collection of independent lordships into a well-ordered duchy, loyal to central authority, showed that William's administrative and military skills were not limited to England, but could be applied successfully two different political and cultural environments. However, William's temporary control over Normandy also created new challenges and responsibilities that would prove increasingly problematic as his reign progressed. The need to maintain order in both England and Normandy required constant attention and substantial resources, stretching the administrative capabilities of his government and creating opportunities for his enemies to exploit any signs of weakness or distraction. The reunification of England and Normandy under William's authority also revived the traditional conflicts with the Kingdom of France, where King Philip I viewed the restoration of Norman power with considerable alarm. The French monarchy had traditionally sought to prevent any single noble family from accumulating too much power along its borders, and the temporary reunification of the Anglo-Norman Empire represented exactly the kind of threat that French policy was designed to prevent. The resulting conflict with France required William to maintain substantial military forces on the continental frontier while continuing to deal with domestic challenges in England. This dual responsibility created enormous financial pressures that contributed to the increasingly harsh taxation policies that made William so unpopular with his subjects during the later years of his reign. The success of William's Norman regency also created expectations among his supporters that he would find a way to make his control over the duchy permanent when Robert returned from crusade. However, any attempt to dispossess Robert permanently would represent a clear violation of their agreement and would likely provoke a major conflict that could destabilize both kingdoms and provide opportunities for their enemies to exploit Norman divisions. As the 1090s progressed, it became increasingly clear that William's temporary successes had created as many problems as they had solved. His harsh taxation policies had generated widespread resentment among his English subjects. His conflicts with the Church had created a powerful constituency of opposition among the clergy, and his expansion of royal authority had alarmed nobles, who valued their traditional autonomy and privileges. The growing opposition to William's rule was not organized into a coherent resistance movement, but it created an atmosphere of tension and dissatisfaction that would prove increasingly dangerous. As his reign approached its mysterious conclusion, the very success of his policies in strengthening royal authority and accumulating wealth and power had also made him more isolated and dependent on a narrowing circle of supporters who shared in the benefits of his rule. The personal characteristics that had served William well during the early challenges of his reign, his aggressive determination, his willingness to break with tradition, and his indifference to the opinions of his critics, had become liabilities as his authority became more secure and the need for coalition building became more important than the need for decisive action. By 1096, William Rufus had achieved most of the goals that had motivated his seizure of the throne 9 years earlier. He had established his legitimacy as king, neutralized internal and external threats to his authority, accumulated substantial wealth, and temporarily reunited his father's empire under his own control. However, these very successes had created new challenges and enemies that would ultimately contribute to the mysterious circumstances of his death in the New Forest 4 years later. The transformation of William from an energetic young prince, fighting for survival, into an established monarch increasingly isolated by his own success, represented one of the classic patterns of medieval royal biography. The skills and characteristics that enabled rulers to seize and consolidate power were not always the same ones needed to maintain authority over the long term, and William's reign illustrated both the possibilities and the limitations of medieval kingship when exercised by a strong and determined, but ultimately inflexible ruler. The stage was now set for the final act of William's reign, as the temporary arrangements that had given him control over Normandy approached their end, and the various tensions that had built up during his years in power began to approach a crisis that would ultimately be resolved in the most dramatic and mysterious way possible. The middle years of William Rufus's reign, spanning roughly from 1090 to 1096, represented the period when his most controversial and defining characteristics as a monarch became fully apparent. Having successfully established his authority and neutralized the immediate threats to his throne, William now had the freedom to implement policies that reflected his own priorities and personality, often with little regard for the concerns of those who disagreed with his approach. Whether these reports of supernatural warnings were genuine contemporary observations or later literary embellishments designed to give religious meaning to political events, remains a matter of scholarly debate. However, their persistence in multiple independent sources suggests that the final years of William's reign were indeed characterized by unusual tension and uncertainty about the future. The source of this unease was not difficult to identify. By 1097, many of the arrangements that had provided stability during the middle years of William's reign were beginning to unravel, creating new challenges and uncertainties that threatened to destabilize everything he had achieved. Most significantly, Robert Curthos's crusading expedition was approaching its successful conclusion, meaning that William would soon be required to relinquish his control over Normandy and return to the more limited authority he had exercised. Before 1096, the prospect of losing Normandy represented more than a simple reduction in William's territorial control. It threatened to undo many of the strategic and political advantages that had made his later reign so successful. The reunification of England and Normandy under his authority had eliminated the divided loyalties that had plagued Anglo-Norman nobles for nearly a decade, provided access to additional military and financial resources, and positioned William as one of the most powerful rulers in northwestern Europe. More seriously, the restoration of Robert's authority in Normandy would recreate all the problems that had led to the original agreement in 1096. Robert's fundamental unsuitability for effective rule had not been corrected by his experiences on crusade. If anything, his success as a military leader in the Holy Land might have increased his confidence without improving his practical judgment or administrative competence. The prospect of renewed chaos in Normandy, with its inevitable impact on English interests, must have weighed heavily on William's mind during these final years. The question of what to do about Robert's impending return became more pressing as reports arrived from the Holy Land describing the spectacular success of the First Crusade. The capture of Jerusalem in July 1099 had been achieved largely through the military leadership of nobles like Robert, who had earned tremendous prestige and glory through their participation in what was widely viewed as the greatest Christian victory in centuries. Robert's enhanced reputation as a crusading hero created new challenges for William, who had chosen to remain in England rather than participate in what many contemporaries viewed as a sacred duty for Christian rulers. While William's decision had been politically and strategically sound, his absence would have created opportunities for his enemies and potentially destabilized both England and Normandy. It left him vulnerable to criticism from those who believed that religious obligations should take precedence over temporal concerns. The contrast between the brothers' reputations during this period could hardly have been greater. Robert returned from the Holy Land covered in glory as one of the heroes of the crusade, widely praised for his courage, leadership, and devotion to the Christian cause. William, meanwhile, was increasingly criticized for his conflicts with the Church, his harsh taxation policies, and his apparent indifference to religious sensibilities. This shift in their relative standing created new political dynamics that would influence the final phase of William's reign. Adding to William's concerns was the question of what Robert intended to do with the wealth and prestige he had accumulated. During his crusading adventures, reports from the Holy Land indicated that Robert had not only distinguished himself militarily, but had also acquired substantial treasure through conquest and diplomatic arrangements with local rulers. More significantly, he had married Sibylla, daughter of Geoffrey of Conversano, a wealthy Norman lord in southern Italy, bringing him both a substantial dowry and important new political connections. The prospect of Robert returning to Normandy, with enhanced resources, increased prestige, and powerful new allies represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power between the brothers. During the chaotic years before 1096, William had been able to exploit Robert's weakness and financial difficulties to extend his own influence. Now, Robert's success on crusade threatened to eliminate these advantages and might even reverse their relative positions. William's response to these challenges demonstrated both his political intelligence and his growing desperation, as traditional solutions proved inadequate to the problems he faced. Rather than simply waiting for Robert's return and hoping for the best, he began implementing policies designed to strengthen his own position while creating obstacles to Robert's restoration of effective authority in Normandy. One of the most significant of these measures was William's systematic effort to bind Norman nobles to his own cause through generous grants of land, titles, and privileges that would be difficult for Robert to reverse without provoking widespread resistance. This policy was expensive and required William to draw heavily on the accumulated wealth of both England and Normandy, but it created a powerful constituency of supporters who had strong personal incentives to maintain his authority. William also began strengthening the fortifications and military resources of territories under his direct control, particularly in areas along the Norman-French border, where conflicts with King Philip of France were most likely to occur. These preparations required substantial investment in castle construction, weapons procurement, and the recruitment of professional soldiers. But they demonstrated William's determination to maintain his authority regardless of the diplomatic and legal arrangements that had originally brought him to power in Normandy. The most controversial aspect of William's preparations for Robert's return was his apparent decision to ignore or actively undermine the religious obligations that were supposed to motivate crusading expeditions. While Robert and other crusading nobles were fighting in the Holy Land ostensibly to serve God and protect Christian pilgrims, William was using their absence to strengthen his own temporal power without regard for the spiritual purposes that had justified the entire enterprise. This disconnect between William's secular calculations and the religious motivations of the crusading movement created additional tensions with church authorities who were already critical of his policies and behavior. Archbishop Anselm, in particular, became increasingly vocal in his criticism of what he saw as William's exploitation of a sacred enterprise for purely selfish purposes. The conflict with Anselm reached its climax during this period, as the archbishop's growing opposition to royal policies made it impossible for him to continue serving as a member of William's government. The fundamental disagreement between church and crown over the proper relationship between spiritual and temporal authority had been exacerbated by William's increasingly aggressive assertion of royal prerogatives and his apparent indifference to ecclesiastical concerns. Anselm's decision to leave England in 1097 represented both a personal defeat for William and a broader symbol of the isolation that was characterizing the final years of his reign. The departure of the realm's most senior churchman was widely interpreted as a condemnation of royal policies and provided William's critics with powerful ammunition for their arguments that his rule had become tyrannical and irreligious. The absence of Anselm also eliminated one of the few remaining voices of moderation and moral authority within William's government, leaving him increasingly dependent on advisors. who shared his secular priorities and were less likely to challenge his more controversial decisions. This narrowing of counsel contributed to the development of policies that were politically effective in the short term, but created long-term problems that would ultimately prove unsolvable. The systematic nature of William's preparation for Robert's return suggests that by 1098 he had already decided that he would not voluntarily relinquish his control over Normandy when the original mortgage agreement expired. This decision, if it was indeed made, represented a fundamental breach of the arrangement that had brought him to power in Normandy, and would inevitably lead to conflict between the brothers when Robert attempted to reclaim his duchy. The prospect of renewed civil war between England and Normandy created additional pressures on William to strengthen his military and financial position, while he still had access to the resources of both territories. The taxation policies that had already made him unpopular with his English subjects became even more severe during this period, as William extracted every possible penny from his kingdom to fund his preparations for the coming conflict. Contemporary chroniclers reported that William's demands for money became increasingly creative and oppressive during these final years. Traditional feudal obligations were expanded and reinterpreted to require additional payments. New taxes were imposed on previously exempt activities, and the practice of selling royal pardons and privileges was extended to cover an ever-widening range of circumstances. These policies generated substantial revenue, but also created a growing constituency of opposition among all levels of English society. The harshness of William's fiscal policies was exemplified by his treatment of inheritance cases, where he systematically exploited his feudal rights to extract maximum financial advantage from the deaths of his nobles. Rather than allowing inheritances to pass smoothly to legal heirs upon payment of traditional relief fees, William often demanded enormous payments that sometimes exceeded the annual income of the estates in question. Heirs who could not afford these payments found their lands confiscated and redistributed to royal supporters who were willing to pay the required sums. Similarly, William's control over the marriages of noble heiresses became a significant source of both revenue and political patronage. Rather than allowing these women to marry according to family arrangements or personal preference, William systematically auctioned their marriages to the highest bidders, treating them essentially as royal commodities to be sold for the benefit of the crown. This practice was legally justifiable under feudal law, but represented a harsh interpretation of royal prerogatives that outraged families who had expected to control their own matrimonial arrangements. The extension of these exploitative policies to church property created even more serious opposition, as William systematically appropriated the revenues of vacant ecclesiastical offices while delaying the appointment of new bishops and abbots who might challenge his authority. By 1099, contemporary sources reported that William was collecting the income from numerous bishoprics and major monasteries, representing a massive transfer of wealth from religious to secular purposes. The financial resources generated by these policies enabled William to maintain substantial military forces and fund extensive preparations for the conflict with Robert that seemed increasingly inevitable. However, the political costs of his harsh taxation and arbitrary government were equally substantial, creating an atmosphere of resentment and opposition that would ultimately contribute to the circumstances of his death. The year 1099 marked a turning point in William's reign, as several developments combined to create a sense of impending crisis that affected everyone connected to the royal court. The successful conclusion of the First Crusade meant that Robert's return to Europe was now imminent, while reports from Normandy indicated that many nobles were already preparing to welcome back their legitimate duke and abandon their temporary allegiance to William. More ominously, The continuing conflict with France was requiring increasing attention and resources as king. Philip began supporting Norman nobles who opposed William's authority. The French king's decision to provide sanctuary and assistance to William's enemies represented a serious escalation of their rivalry and threatened to transform what had been a manageable local conflict into a broader European war. The military situation in Normandy deteriorated significantly during 1099, as several important fortresses were captured by forces loyal to Robert or supported by French gold. The loss of these strategic positions threatened William's ability to maintain control over the duchy and suggested that his enemies were gaining confidence as Robert's return approached. William's response to these military setbacks demonstrated both his personal courage and his sometimes reckless disregard for the political consequences of his actions. Rather than attempting to negotiate a peaceful resolution of the growing crisis, he chose to escalate the conflict by launching aggressive campaigns designed to crush his opponents before Robert could return to claim his inheritance. The most significant of these campaigns was William's expedition to recapture the city of Le Mans, which had been seized by forces loyal to Helios de la Flache, with support from the Count of Anjou. The loss of this strategically important city represented more than a simple military defeat, symbolized the breakdown of the arrangements that had given William control over Maine and threatened to encourage further defections among Norman nobles who were beginning to doubt his ability to maintain authority in the face of growing opposition. William's personal participation in the siege of Le Mans demonstrated his determination to resolve the crisis through military action rather than diplomatic compromise. Contemporary accounts describe his furious energy during the campaign as he drove his forces relentlessly in pursuit of victory while apparently ignoring the political and strategic risks created by his absence from England. The successful recapture of Le Mans provided William with a temporary military victory, but it also revealed the growing costs of his aggressive policies. The campaign had required enormous expenditures of money and manpower, had kept William away from England during a critical period, and had further alienated church authorities who disapproved of the violence and destruction associated with the siege. More significantly, the Le Mans campaign demonstrated that William's control over his continental territories was becoming increasingly dependent on his personal presence and direct military intervention. This was an inherently unstable situation that could not be maintained indefinitely, especially given the other demands on his time and attention created by his responsibilities as King of England. The return journey from Le Mans to England in the summer of 1099 provided William with ample opportunity to reflect on the deteriorating situation and the limited options available to him for resolving the growing crisis. Contemporary sources suggest that he was increasingly moody and unpredictable during this period, alternating between bursts of confident energy and periods of brooding reflection that worried his advisors and companions. The decision to spend the winter of 1099 to 1100 in England rather than remaining in Normandy to consolidate his military gains was interpreted by contemporary observers as evidence that William recognized the need to restore his position in his home kingdom before the final confrontation with Robert. The months between his return from Le Mans and his death in the New Forest were characterized by intensive political and military preparations that suggested he was planning for a major conflict in the near future. During this period, William's behavior became increasingly erratic and controversial as he seemed to abandon any pretense of conventional royal dignity in favor of ostentatious displays of wealth and power that scandalized even his supporters. Contemporary chroniclers reported that his court became more luxurious and extravagant than ever before, with enormous expenditures on clothing, entertainment, and personal comfort that seemed designed to demonstrate his continued prosperity. Despite the mounting challenges to his authority, the most notorious example of William's extravagance during this period was his response to a servant who had purchased a pair of shoes for him at the cost of 3 shillings. According to the chronicler's account, William flew into a rage at what he considered an insulting attempt to economize on royal expenses, shouting, "You son of a whore! Since when does a king wear shoes that cost only 3 shillings? Go and bring me a pair that costs at least a mark of silver." This incident, whether literally true or embellished in the retelling, captured perfectly the combination of arrogance, extravagance, and disconnection from reality that characterized William's behavior during his final months. The ostentatious waste of money on trivial luxuries while his subjects groaned under heavy taxation demonstrated either a complete lack of political judgment or a deliberate decision to flaunt his power, regardless of the consequences. Similar stories circulated about William's treatment of other aspects of royal ceremonial and daily life, as he seemed determined to surpass all previous standards of royal magnificence, while ignoring the growing criticism of his policies and behavior. The construction projects initiated during this period, including extensive renovations to royal residences and the commissioning of elaborate works of art and decoration, required enormous expenditures that further strained the royal finances and necessitated even harsher taxation policies. The political implications of this ostentatious display of wealth were significant, as William seemed to be deliberately provoking his critics while demonstrating his continued access to enormous financial resources. The message was clear. Despite the mounting opposition to his rule, he retained the power to extract wealth from his subjects and to spend it as he pleased, without regard for their concerns or objections. However, this strategy of ruling through intimidation and displays of power was inherently risky, as it depended on William's ability to maintain his authority through force rather than building sustainable political coalitions. The growing isolation of the royal court from broader currents of opinion in English society was becoming increasingly apparent, as even traditionally loyal supporters began to express private doubts about the wisdom and sustainability of royal policies. The religious calendar of early 1100 provided numerous opportunities for public displays of royal authority, but William's participation in these ceremonial occasions seems to have generated more criticism than support. His conflicts with the Church had made it impossible for him to present himself as a conventionally pious ruler, while his personal lifestyle continued to scandalize observers who expected their king to demonstrate at least minimal respect for Christian moral teachings. The absence of Archbishop Anselm was particularly problematic during this period, as it left England without effective ecclesiastical leadership and created a visible symbol of the breakdown in relations between church and crown. William's continued appropriation of Canterbury's revenues while refusing to allow Anselm's return from exile demonstrated his determination to maintain his authority over church affairs, regardless of the spiritual and political costs. The winter months of 1099 to 1100 were also marked by increasing reports of strange omens and supernatural warnings that seemed to foretell disaster for the royal house. Contemporary chroniclers recorded numerous accounts of prophetic dreams, unusual natural phenomena, and other signs that were interpreted as divine warnings about the consequences of William's policies and behavior. While modern historians are naturally skeptical about the literal truth of these supernatural accounts, their prevalence in contemporary sources suggests that they reflected genuine anxiety about the direction of royal policy and the stability of the kingdom. The circulation of stories about divine displeasure with William's rule provided a religious framework for expressing political opposition that might otherwise have been dangerous to voice directly. The most detailed of these supernatural warnings was recorded by the chronicler William of Malmesbury, who described a prophetic dream experienced by a monk at Gloucester on the night before William's death. According to this account, The monk dreamed that he saw William enter a church and approach the crucifix on the altar with menacing and insolent gestures. In the dream, William bit the arms of the figure of Christ and nearly tore away the legs, before the image came to life and kicked him so violently that he fell backward, and from his mouth, as he lay prostrate, issued so copious a flame that the volumes of smoke touched the very stars. Whether this dream actually occurred as described, or was invented later to provide religious meaning to William's death, it perfectly captured the contemporary view of his relationship with the Church and the spiritual consequences of his policies. The image of William attacking the figure of Christ while being punished by divine intervention provided a powerful metaphor for the conflict between temporal and spiritual authority that had defined much of his reign. Similar warnings were reportedly received by other members of the court, including Robert Fitzhamon, one of William's most trusted supporters, who was told about the monk's dream and urged to warn the king against going hunting on the following day. According to the chronicler's account, Fitzhamon did indeed report the dream to William, who responded with characteristic mockery, "He is a monk, and dreams for money like a monk. Give him 100 shillings." These accounts of supernatural warnings served multiple purposes for contemporary chroniclers. They provided religious explanations for political events, demonstrated divine disapproval of royal policies, and created dramatic narrative tension leading up to William's mysterious death. Whether or not they reflected genuine contemporary experiences, they revealed the atmosphere of anxiety and foreboding that characterized the final months of William's reign. The spring and early summer of 1100 brought increasingly urgent reports about Robert's progress through southern Italy as he made his way back to Normandy with his new wife and the wealth he had accumulated during his crusading adventures. These reports created mounting pressure on William to decide whether he would honor his original agreement to restore Robert's authority in Normandy or attempt to maintain his control over the duchy through force. The military preparations that had characterized the previous year intensified during this period, as William assembled forces and supplies for what seemed likely to be a major conflict in the near future. However, these preparations were complicated by the need to maintain adequate defenses in England while preparing for offensive operations in Normandy, stretching the resources of his government and creating additional financial pressures that required even more aggressive taxation policies. The decision of where to spend the summer of 1100 became a crucial strategic choice for William, as he needed to position himself to respond quickly to Robert's return while maintaining control over his various territories and responsibilities. The choice to remain in England during July and early August rather than crossing to Normandy was interpreted by contemporary observers as evidence that William was still hoping to avoid an immediate confrontation with his brother. This interpretation was supported by reports that William had been negotiating secretly with some of Robert's supporters, apparently hoping to undermine his brother's position before he could return to claim his inheritance. These negotiations required considerable diplomatic skill and substantial financial resources, as William needed to convince Norman nobles that their interests would be better served by continuing to support his authority rather than welcoming back their legitimate duke. The complexity of these negotiations was increased by the involvement of King Philip of France, who had his own reasons for preferring to see the Norman territories remain divided between competing brothers rather than reunited under either William or Robert. French policy had traditionally sought to prevent any single noble from accumulating too much power along the kingdom's borders, and the potential reunification of England and Normandy under Robert's authority represented exactly the kind of threat that French diplomacy was designed to prevent. William's final weeks were spent in a frenzy of political and military activity as he attempted to complete his preparations for the coming crisis while maintaining the pretense of normal royal government. The royal court moved between various residences in southern England, ostensibly following the traditional summer progress, but actually positioning itself to respond quickly to developments in Normandy or to embark for the continent if circumstances required immediate action. Contemporary accounts suggest that William's mood during this period alternated between confident optimism about his ability to outmaneuver Robert and periods of dark brooding about the consequences of failure. The strain of maintaining multiple complex negotiations while preparing for possible military action was beginning to show in his behavior, as he became increasingly short-tempered with advisors who brought unwelcome news or failed to achieve the results he demanded. The decision to spend the first days of August 1100 hunting in the New Forest represented either a return to one of William's favorite recreational activities or a deliberate attempt to project an image of confidence and normalcy despite the mounting pressures of the political situation. The New Forest had been one of his father's favorite hunting grounds and held strong associations with Norman royal power and tradition, making it an appropriate location for what would prove to be William's final public appearance. The hunting party that assembled at Brockenhurst on August 1st included many of the most important figures in William's government and household, suggesting that this was intended to be more than a simple recreational expedition. The presence of his younger brother Henry, along with various nobles and officials who rarely participated in purely social activities, indicated that important political discussions were likely to take place alongside the hunting itself. Evening of August 1st was reportedly spent in feasting and discussion, as William and his companions reviewed the political situation and made final preparations for the challenges that lay ahead. Contemporary sources suggest that the atmosphere was tense despite the festive surroundings, as everyone present was aware that crucial decisions about the future of the Anglo-Norman Empire would need to be made very soon. The events of August 2nd, 1100, would transform this tense political gathering into one of the most enduring mysteries in English royal history. What began as a routine hunting expedition in familiar territory would end with the sudden death of one of medieval England's most controversial kings and the beginning of conspiracy theories that persist to this day. The morning of August 2nd dawned clear and bright, with excellent conditions for hunting in the dense woodlands of the New Forest. William rose early and participated in the traditional preparations for the day's sport, including the blessing of weapons and the assignment of positions to various members of the hunting party. Contemporary accounts suggest that he was in good spirits and showed no signs of the anxiety or premonition that later chroniclers would claim had characterized his final days. The hunting party separated into smaller groups according to established custom, with each group taking responsibility for a different section of the forest. This arrangement was designed to maximize the chances of success while ensuring that the various participants could enjoy the sport without interfering with each other's activities. William chose to hunt with a small group that included Walter Tyrrell, Lord of Poy, one of his most skilled archers and a trusted member of his household. Walter Tyrrell was a Norman nobleman who had served William faithfully for several years and had gained a reputation as one of the finest marksmen in the royal court. His presence in William's hunting party was unremarkable, as he had participated in numerous similar expeditions and enjoyed the king's confidence and friendship. The relationship between the two men was reportedly warm and informal, characterized by the kind of easy companionship that William valued in his closest associates. The tragic events that followed have been preserved in multiple contemporary accounts, though they differ in significant details and leave many crucial questions unanswered. According to the most widely accepted version of events, William and Walter Tyrrell were pursuing a stag through the dense woodland when an arrow was fired that struck the king in the chest, piercing his heart and killing him almost instantly. The exact circumstances of this fatal shot remain unclear, as there were apparently no reliable eyewitnesses to the moment when the arrow was released. Contemporary chroniclers provided various explanations for what had happened. Some suggested that Tyrell had been aiming at the stag when his arrow deflected off a tree or other obstacle and struck the king by accident, while others claimed that the arrow had been intended for the animal but had missed its target and struck William instead. What is certain is that William died immediately from his wound, without speaking or showing any signs of life after being struck. The arrow apparently pierced his heart with such force that death was instantaneous, giving him no opportunity to call for help, receive last rites, or make any final statements about the succession or other matters of state. The immediate aftermath of William's death was characterized by confusion and panic, as the members of the hunting party struggled to understand what had happened and to decide how to respond to the unprecedented situation. Walter Tyrrell, whether or not he was actually responsible for the fatal shot, quickly fled the scene and made his way to the Norman coast, where he took ship for France and safety beyond the reach of English justice. The king's body was left lying in the forest for several hours before being discovered by local peasants, who recognized the royal dress and ornaments and realized the significance of their find. These humble folk, identified in later sources as charcoal burners or other forest workers, loaded the corpse onto a simple cart and began the long journey to Winchester, where royal tradition required that English kings be buried. The journey from the New Forest to Winchester took the better part of a day, and contemporary accounts describe how blood dripped from the cart throughout the entire trip, creating a gruesome trail that marked the passage of the royal cortege. This detail, whether literally true or added for dramatic effect, became one of the most memorable aspects of the entire story and contributed to the sense that William's death had been accompanied by supernatural signs and portents. The arrival of William's body at Winchester Cathedral created a sensation, as news of the king's death spread rapidly throughout the city and the surrounding countryside. However, the reaction was notably different from what might have been expected following the death of a beloved monarch. Instead of widespread mourning and expressions of grief, the prevailing response seems to have been uncertainty about what would happen next and concern about the potential for political instability. The burial ceremony that followed was remarkably modest for a royal funeral, lacking the pomp and ceremony that usually accompanied such occasions. This may have been due to the suddenness of William's death and the lack of time for proper preparations, but it may also have reflected the limited number of mourners who were genuinely grieved by his passing. Contemporary sources suggest that the funeral was attended primarily by religious officials and court functionaries rather than the broad cross-section of nobility and clergy who would normally have participated in such an important ceremony. William's body was interred beneath the central tower of Winchester Cathedral, in a location that emphasized his status as a legitimate king, while following established traditions for royal burial. However, the simplicity of the tomb and the brevity of the funeral service suggested that even his supporters were eager to conclude the proceedings and move on to the pressing question of the succession. The most dramatic development in the immediate aftermath of William's death was the lightning-fast action taken by his younger brother Henry to seize control of the kingdom, before any potential rivals could organize opposition. Henry, who had been present at the hunting expedition but was apparently in a different part of the forest when the fatal accident occurred, moved with remarkable speed and efficiency to secure his own succession to the throne. Within hours of learning about William's death, Henry was riding hard toward Winchester to gain control of the royal treasury, the key to political power in medieval England. His rapid movement and apparent foreknowledge of what needed to be done has been cited by conspiracy theorists as evidence that William's death was not the accident it appeared to be, but was instead part of a carefully planned assassination designed to place Henry on the throne. The seizure of the treasury at Winchester required Henry to overcome the resistance of officials who might have preferred to wait for the return of Robert Curtis, the eldest surviving brother, who had a strong claim to inherit William's crown along with his Norman territories. However, Henry's combination of personal charm, political skill, and apparent determination convinced these officials to grant him access to the royal wealth that would enable him to reward supporters and fund his bid for the throne. With the treasury secured, Henry moved immediately to London, where he was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey on August 5th, just 3 days after William's death. The speed of this coronation was unprecedented in English royal history and demonstrated both Henry's political acumen and the effectiveness of whatever preparations he had made for this eventuality. The coronation ceremony was performed by Maurice, Bishop of London, in the absence of more senior ecclesiastical officials who might have questioned the legitimacy of Henry's claim or demanded more time to consider the implications of their actions. The bishop's willingness to perform the ceremony despite its irregular circumstances provided Henry with the religious legitimacy that was essential for medieval royal authority. Henry's first actions as king demonstrated his understanding of the political challenges he faced and his determination to neutralize potential opposition before it could organize effectively. He issued a charter promising to reform the harsh policies that had made William so unpopular, including the excessive taxation, arbitrary treatment of noble inheritances, and exploitation of church revenues that had characterized the later years of the previous reign. These promises represented a dramatic reversal of royal policy and were clearly designed to win support from the various groups that had been alienated by William's government. However, they also created expectations that would prove difficult to fulfill and established precedents that would constrain Henry's own exercise of royal authority in ways that his brother had never accepted. The question of whether William's death was really an accident or part of a conspiracy to place Henry on the throne has fascinated historians and popular writers for nearly 1,000 years. The circumstantial evidence for a conspiracy is intriguing but far from conclusive, consisting primarily of the suspicious timing of the death, Henry's remarkably rapid response, and the subsequent favoritism shown to members of Walter Tyle's family. Supporters of the conspiracy theory point out that Henry was the person who benefited most, obviously, from William's death, as it eliminated the obstacle to his own royal ambitions while avoiding the need for a potentially destructive civil war with Robert. They also note that hunting accidents, while common in medieval society, provided convenient cover for assassination, as the presence of weapons and the isolated location made it difficult to distinguish between accident and murder. The behavior of Walter Tyrrell, whether or not he was actually responsible for the fatal shot, has also been cited as evidence of a conspiracy. His immediate flight from England and his subsequent refusal to return, even when offered safe conduct, suggests either guilt about his role in the king's death or knowledge of circumstances that would have made his presence dangerous to the new regime. More intriguingly, Henry's apparent preparation for the succession suggests that he had at least considered the possibility of William's death and had made plans for how to respond to such an eventuality. While this might simply reflect prudent contingency planning by an ambitious prince, it could also indicate foreknowledge of a planned assassination that would create the opportunity he needed to seize the throne. However, the evidence for a conspiracy remains entirely circumstantial, and there are equally plausible explanations for all the suspicious circumstances surrounding William's death. Hunting accidents were genuinely common in medieval society, particularly among members of the nobility who regularly participated in dangerous sports involving weapons and wild animals. The New Forest itself had already claimed the lives of several members of the royal family, making it a particularly hazardous location for such activities. Henry's rapid response to his brother's death might reflect careful preparation, but it could equally well demonstrate his natural political instincts and his recognition that speed was essential if he hoped to secure the throne before Robert could return from the crusade. Medieval succession crises were typically won by the candidate who moved most quickly and decisively, and Henry's actions were entirely consistent with established patterns of royal politics. The flight of Walter Tyrrell, meanwhile, might reflect guilt about his role in an accidental death rather than knowledge of a deliberate murder. Medieval justice was often harsh and arbitrary, and even accidental killing of a king might have resulted in severe punishment regardless of the actual circumstances. Tyrrell's decision to flee to safety rather than risk the unpredictable reactions of a grieving court was entirely understandable, even if he bore no real responsibility for what had happened. The enduring fascination with William's death reflects both the dramatic circumstances of the event and the controversial nature of his reign. A king who had generated so much opposition during his lifetime was a natural target for conspiracy theories, particularly when his death occurred under circumstances that removed him from power at a moment when his authority was being challenged. On multiple fronts, the mystery of William Rufus's death has inspired numerous works of fiction, historical speculation, and scholarly investigation over the centuries since 1100. Each generation has interpreted the available evidence according to its own assumptions about medieval politics and the nature of royal power, creating a constantly evolving dialogue between historical fact and literary imagination. What remains certain is that William's death marked the end of one of the most controversial and complex reigns in medieval English history. His 13 years on the throne had been characterized by constant conflict, remarkable achievements, and policies that generated both admiration and hatred among his contemporaries. His sudden death in the New Forest eliminated a formidable personality from the medieval political stage and created opportunities for his successors to chart new directions for the English monarchy. The transformation of William Rufus from living king to a historical mystery began almost immediately after his death, as chroniclers and storytellers began creating the narratives that would preserve his memory for future generations. The combination of his controversial policies, dramatic personality, and mysterious end provided rich material for both historical analysis and literary imagination, ensuring that his story would continue to fascinate readers and scholars for centuries to come. Today, more than 900 years after that fateful morning in the New Forest, William Rufus remains one of the most intriguing figures in English royal history. His reign demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of medieval monarchy, while his death continues to generate questions about the nature of political power and the role of chance in shaping historical events. Whether accident or assassination, William's death in the New Forest brought to a close the life of one of medieval England's most complex and controversial rulers. The Red King had lived as dramatically as he died, leaving behind a legacy that continues to provoke debate and speculation among all who encounter his remarkable story. In the quiet depths of the New Forest, where ancient trees still stand as silent witnesses to that long-ago tragedy, the mystery of William Rufus continues to whisper its secrets to anyone willing to listen to the echoes of medieval England's most enigmatic king. And so ends our gentle journey through the life and mysterious death of William Rufus, the Red King whose reign challenged conventions and whose end in the forest depths remains one of history's most captivating puzzles. Sleep peacefully, dear listener. And may your dreams carry you safely through the shadows of the Norman woods to the dawn of peaceful rest.